Welcome back to the Down Below, where I'll be covering episode 4 of Silo. Now, I've reviewed the first 3 episodes on the channel already, so if you haven't watched those, they're sitting there waiting for you. And speaking of underground covert operations, we've got a brand new project that we're launching called the Horror Exchange. Please see the link down below for that in the description. And as always, this is your spoiler warning, so if you haven't seen episode 4 yet, well, I'm going to ruin it for you. Straight off the bat, this episode panned out pretty much just exactly as I was expecting. It's well and truly a filler episode, which every series really needs to flesh out its characters, but I'm pleasantly surprised that the writers waited until episode 4 to take their foot off the gas and put the series in cruise control for a little bit. So episode 4 kicks off set in the past, where we see flashbacks of Juliet's mother and her 11-year-old brother, who is using some kind of breathing apparatus, but he's clearly very, very ill, to which we find out he dies soon after. And this flashback is triggered by Juliet standing in front of her father's doctor's surgery, now that she's starting this new role as sheriff and is operating on the upper floors of the silo for the first time since she was a child. But this is pretty much how the structure of this episode pans out. There's a lot of triggered flashbacks from Juliet's childhood before jumping forward in time back to the present again. From a directorial standpoint, it's a great way to develop the backstory of our protagonists and put some more meat on their bones to make you care about them a little bit more, whilst simultaneously stalling the progression of the linear timeline, which is currently focusing on Juliet finding this secret door that George is pointing her to. Another character who receives much more emphasis in this episode is Deputy Marnes, who seems to be having a nervous breakdown off the back of episode 3's events. Mayor Johns has been pronounced dead in her apartment, and this is shown in one of the opening scenes of her body being covered whilst surrounded by Sims, Marnes and Bernard. But more on Marnes a little bit later. Following the title screen, we jump back into Juliet's past to a scene where her father, Dr. Peter Nichols, is arguing with Juliet about her brother and mother's possessions being long overdue going to recycling. Again, what I'm enjoying about this series so much so far is how in each episode they drop another quirk or rule into the mix about certain rules or practices that are adopted within the silo. For example, anybody who dies or moves out from their living quarters has their possessions sent to the recycling pit, where they're stripped down and used for other purposes, where materials find some sort of practical use. Failing that, they're incinerated. It's a cool concept because this civilization have found a way to be optimally sustainable and never waste any precious resource, but the nature of it is just brutal. There's no room for sentimentality because it's against the pact. Everything must be recycled. But young Juliet doesn't do this. She drops off all of her mother's and brother's possessions except for one, her mother's chair. It's broken and unusable, but she decides to salvage this chair, go against protocol and fix it herself. Her father comes home from work and he's angry about the fact that she hasn't taken it to be dumped, but he speaks a line of dialogue that's quite intriguing to me. He says, "Not everything can be fixed." Now, this is probably the catalyst, I believe, for why Juliet is such a good engineer. It all traces back to this emotional connection to this chair. Things don't have to be forgotten, left behind, or repurposed. They can be fixed, and she can fix them. A few scenes later, we revert back to Juliet's past again, where she's assigned a job from Miss Walker by request of her father, Dr. Nichols' letter. She's sent to scavenge, which is basically the recycling dump where discarded items fall through the ceiling every 5 minutes and get sorted into piles. It's grunt work, and it's interesting to see Juliet's self-appointed fall from grace from being the daughter of a doctor to working at a dystopian garbage tip. We find out that this letter has been forged by Juliet when her father shows up to Miss Walker's workshop to ask where his daughter is. But it's just a bit of an odd relationship that they've got. Juliet has ran away all the way to the bottom of the silo. She's relegated herself to the pits of the economic chain because she's mad at her dad for her brother and mother dying. There must be more to this though than what meets the eye, because this just doesn't really make sense to me, that kind of reaction, and it must be getting revealed in later episodes, so hopefully it does, because at the moment it just seems a little bit unrealistic to me in terms of her reaction. Back in the present, adult Juliet is settling in nicely to her new life on the upper levels as the sheriff, and she's handed the keys to Holston's living quarters and office. Unfortunately, she's got the most obnoxious, irritating personal assistant that I think I've ever come across. She jokes about how she's been requested to stock Juliet's fridge for her, but she doesn't know what they eat down deep. Shut up and boot me meetings, man, will ya? You're the assistant to the regional manager, mate. You're not the assistant regional manager. F*** off, you ignorant f***. but again, a gentle reminder of how certain upbringings and backgrounds are perceived amongst the residents. But yet again, we're treated to another fascinating nuance of how the silo operates. When you start a new job, you take the predecessor's house. There isn't a property market of sorts. You don't exchange money to move into a new accommodation. It's attached to your occupation, which forms a major part of your status. But bringing it back to Deputy Marnes, well, he's just going a little bit mental in this episode. It's clear that he's massively struggling with the death of Mayor Johns. He ends up beating up a guy called Frankie who gave some dodgy alcohol to some residents a few years ago, so he's just projecting his anger at this point. But the interactions between him and Juliet get a lot of screen time. They make a deal where if he helps her identify who killed George, she'll help him find Mayor Johns' killer. They seem to be striking up a decent rapport here until Sims visits Deputy Marnes' living quarters. They exchange some emphatic talk before Sims states that over in Judicial, everything is prepared for Billings to replace Juliet as mayor. I'd say Marnes is slightly resistant to this, but it's left quite open-ended and ambiguous as they toast to the good of the silo. They've got a strange relationship, but it's unclear whose side Marnes is really on at this point. He's agreed a deal with Juliet that they'll both scratch each other's backs when investigating the murders of their loved ones, but now he's speaking about replacing her. He's definitely playing both sides, and this is substantiated in a following scene where he's listening on a radio conversation between Miss Walker and Juliet, where Walker has managed to fix the camcorder relic that George has stashed away. The final scene is a shot of Juliet reaching into the air conditioning vent, which has a rattle in it, which is discovered earlier in the episode, where she fishes out a citizen record file of George that she's been looking for. So coming away from this episode, there's a lot of questions that have been raised where answers are up in the air. Overall, I think the episode was notably slower compared to the others, but this sets us up nicely to push the plot forward in episode 5. Personally, I'm excited to see exactly what's on the camcorder, but it'll be also interesting to see if Marnes gets there first now that he's been tipped off about the relic. And that concludes this week's recap and honest review of episode 4 of Silo. As always, please leave your thoughts and opinions down below in the comments, and please like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed this breakdown. We're well on our way to 35,000 subscribers, thanks to you guys. Don't forget to check out Horror Exchange, and once again, I've been your host Hugh from Unleash the Ghouls, and I'll see you next week down below in the Silo.